annual Wilderness Lecture Series. It's sponsored by the Wilderness Institute here at the College of Forestry and Conservation, University of Montana. I'm Lori Young, I'm the Interim Director of the Wilderness Institute. And I'd like to welcome all of you who are joining us for the first time for the lecture series. There are schedules right on that back table behind the television camera. And so if you'd like to pick up a schedule for the whole series, please do. We still have 4 speakers left and a lot of exciting topics. Next week, our speaker will be Germaine White with the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, and she'll be talking about the Mission Mountain Wilderness just north of Missoula. And so please join us next week as well. I'd like to introduce Carol Brewer. Carol is an associate professor of biology here at the University of Montana. She specializes in plant physiological ecology and ecology education, and she'll be introducing our speaker, Ann Bartuska.
All right, thanks, Lori. It really is a great pleasure to have the chance to introduce Dr. Ann Bartuska, our speaker this evening. I don't know if you actually know this, Ann, but I first met Ann when I was a graduate student, and I think it was at an Ecological Society meeting in San Antonio. So this actually was quite a long time ago, and in that first meeting I found Ann to be really engaging and very generous with sharing her ideas and encouragement. And so for probably, gosh, more than a decade, I've really looked up to Ann as an important and very inspirational role model. I've admired her work along with many other women ecologists I know for a very long time, and I know many of you are familiar with her work as well. Ann really is one of our nation's leaders and a pioneering woman in promoting the use of science in policy and decision making about the environment, and she'll tell you a little bit about that tonight. More recently, I've had the opportunity to get to know Ann and to work with her through our shared work on the board of the Ecological Society of America. Now, Dr. Bartuska has a very distinguished career, and I've had to write down some of the highlights. There's so many. She's trained as an ecosystem ecologist. She received her bachelor's degree from Wilkes College. Is that in Pennsylvania?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Wasn't sure. Pennsylvania. Her master's degree from Ohio University and her PhD from West Virginia University. A highly abbreviated list of her career highlights to date include Forest Service posts as the Director of Ecosystem Management, the Director of Forest Health Protection, the Director of Forest Management, and the first woman to hold that post, and also served for a few years as the Executive Director for Invasive Species for the Nature Conservancy. And currently she is the Deputy Chief for Research and Development of the Forest Service. Ann has also been a leader, the past president of the Ecological Society of America, and she's been a leader of the Council of Science Society Presidents. Without a doubt, Ann is a great and inspiring example of the unique talents that scientists bring and the perspectives that they can bring that lead not only to rewarding careers in the academic environment, but also bridge disciplines and make real impacts on how environmental issues are discussed and addressed in our country. So the title of Ann's presentation tonight is Linking Science and Policy, a Comprehensive Approach to Invasive Species. Please welcome with me Dr. Ann Bartuska.
See if it works.
Okay.
If it does, I'll let
Okay.
you.
All right. We're still working on technology here. Well, good evening. It's really a pleasure to be here and to see actually quite a few people who I've known over the years in various settings and had a chance to come back to Missoula too for a visit. I've got a very busy 2 days here. People are really keeping me running, and I hope I have a chance to talk to a few more of you as I go through tomorrow and the subsequent day. I'm going to talk to you about invasive species. It's something that I spent the last 3 years of my life totally focusing on before I came back to the Forest Service. And so what I'm going to talk about is really not the Forest Service story, and it's not the Deputy Chief of Research talking. It's really somebody who's been thinking about this issue and how do we get the best science that we can to a really important policy question. And so what I want to try to do is lay out a little bit. I'm assuming not all of you know everything there is about invasive species. And so we're going to give a little primer on what we know about the issue. And then I really want to get into, given what we know, what should we be doing about it? And then I'm going to finish up with some policy ideas. And hopefully that fits into the 45 minutes that I've been given, plus or minus time for the mic change. So, actually move this over here. So what I'm going to start with is a little bit of the context. Good, it moved. Context for the topic. And one of the first questions always is, what's this issue I'm talking about? When I say invasive species, it's really a code word for non-native invasive species. This is the definition that was promulgated by the White House under the Clinton administration, supported by the Bush administration, that really tries to capture that these are organisms that are alien, not native to an ecosystem, and that there's a direct linkage to harm. And so even though you can quibble with some of the words, for the purposes of this discussion, that's what I thought I would try to focus from. Okay. A momentary pause. Does this work? Yes. Good. Now I don't have to scream at the folks in the back of the room. Okay, you can still hear? Back there? Okay. So just giving a little bit of background on what we do know, and these are some of the most famous and classic examples of invasive species caused extinctions or severe impacts to ecosystems. Things like, this is the brown tree snake, which you can sort of see has become so ubiquitous in certain islands in the Pacific, has basically extirpated all the native birds in Guam. And it's the major effort in Hawaii is to make sure that they do not get brown tree snakes. We've got the crazy ants here with crabs in Christmas Island, Myconia, which is a real common very big leaf species in the Pacific. So those particular things we know we have information on, and we've been able to talk about biodiversity losses associated with invasive species pretty compellingly. And in fact, except for islands, it's the second most significant impact to biodiversity. In islands, it is the most significant impact, and the really tremendous loss of biodiversity. So we have a basis for concern, and it's led to increased understanding of what are the parameters that might be driving really how we would look at invasive species. Ecologically, based on the information on biodiversity, we have good information, not anecdotal, been able to describe it. But when you get beyond just the ecology and some of the ecosystem changes, there's also an economic and a social impact. And that's what I think makes invasive species issues so compelling, because it's not just about ecology. It is about severe economic losses. 137 billion for this country alone annually is an estimate. The 1.4 trillion in losses, if you look at it globally, those are huge numbers. And those are numbers that if they were in any other thing, like wildfires, we'd be doing something a lot more about. But somehow we've not been able to build those kinds of costs into the concerns we have about the role invasive species are playing. And then you talk about the social role. We have a lot less data about that. But there's anecdotal information about people's concerns. Fire ants is a good example. If you have a fire ant, you're not going to be putting your beach towel down and so that you don't have the impact of the fire ants. And those are now continuing to move. They've moved across the U.S. They're in California. There's a major effort to keep them in California and not let them go to Hawaii. You might expect that the Hawaiians are pretty concerned about the potential for ant infestation. And that's just one example of potential social impacts. And we know that some species have cause changes in water and the movement of water quality and quantity. And so that is a not quantified, but we know that there are certain circumstances where there is that linkage between the social benefits of water and invasive species. So if you look at all three of those, it makes, again, a really important consideration for why should we be focusing on this issue. So with that, I want to go and talk a little bit more about what we do know and give you a real, and this is really a sort of a survey rather than a whole lot of detail. There are some people in this audience, I've already talked to them, they're ready to answer your hard questions later on if you get to those. What do we know? We do know that there are certain characteristics of invasiveness that we can be looking for in particular species. The same things that make a weed successful in your backyard make a weed or an insect or a disease or a mammal invasive in other settings. Just being able to have a wide environmental tolerance is obviously would give a species a great advantage. Things like being able to rapidly grow, early maturity, lots of seed, lots of reproduction, all of those just create a species that has a lot of opportunity to explore new niches, to get a hold, and to get established. And I think these have been pretty well described in the literature. We also have increased our knowledge about impacts. Now, in some cases, these tend to be more site-specific and locally driven, but I think over time we've been accumulating information about certain impacts. Things, ecosystem effects, we know increasingly have been described in different settings, whether it be altered soil quality, water quality I've already mentioned. There is a collection of information on ecosystem effects. But we also have habitat changes, population changes, certainly species to species impacts have been pretty well described. And just the other sort of synergistic effects of once you have one invasive established, frequently that leads to a weakening of the system and allowing other invasives to come in. So an overall change in the environment. We also know something about the rate of spread, and this is a exponential growth curve for the expansion of a weed, and this data I think are for weeds, and that idea of having a low or sort of I'll get these buttons straight, having this lag time where you have a fairly low area of infestation followed by a fairly rapid and exponential growth rate and expansion. And this is, I think, pretty typical and has been described for other species. So that should help us better understand population biology. And the importance of that is we know that once they do get established, we can start seeing the very rapid expansion of particular species. This should be setting off alarm bells. If you let something get established, if you let it get very large, it just begins spreading throughout an area. And for those of you interested in wilderness issues, hemlock woolly adelgid is pretty much taken over the hemlocks of the eastern U.S. And a lot of those hemlocks are in areas that we in the East consider our wilderness. They're not very big, but they're really important. So given what we know, and even though some of it is anecdotal and some of it is pretty well described, I think the community has been able to come up with a comprehensive approach to really take the science and start looking at invasive species in a significant way. And now I'm going to talk about this quite a bit, because to me this is where we should be putting our attention. There's essentially several steps to this. It is comprehensive in that if you did all these things, you could be fairly sure that you are going to limit the rate of spread and reduce the problem associated with invasive species. From being able to describe what you have through prevention, early detection and rapid response, control and management and restoration, research, and then finally, public education and awareness, though I know some of you are saying, well, why does this go back up to the top? But that's the way we always order our lists. So what I'm going to go through now is each of these and talk a little bit about them. Starting with assessment and risk analysis, basically what we want to do is have the tools that allow us to better describe where the potential areas of risk are, the likelihood of spread, and where the target species might be. And a good example is being able to take our knowledge of where forest and host species are. In this case, it's the distribution of oak forests in the U.S., and then look at sudden oak death, which is what sod is. This is a fungus that has been killing populations of oak in Northern California and Oregon, and has a very high virulence factor once it gets established, and no control measures right now. So clearly, if you have an isolated population right here of the pathogen, You want to know where the likelihood of spread might be. Having a map like this that tells us that where we have the areas of highest risk of the host species, and in the eastern U.S. and in the south, allows us to better target our monitoring programs. And so this is a very important kind of tool that building that capacity really is one of the first steps for the invasive species issues. The next one I want to talk about, prevention. We have lots of opportunities for species introductions. Many of them are intentional. Horticulture trade has been thriving on the ability to introduce new species to the consumer. And we seem to have an incredible appetite for new species. We're never satisfied with what we have. So they're really providing what we want. Aquaria, the same thing, is being able to provide new and endless sources of new organisms in your home aquarium. But we also have accidental introductions, just hitchhikers along things that we bring in for other reasons, whether it not be, here in this case, weed contaminants in wheat. Sudden oak death, that very clearly came in on some horticultural plants that were brought in from Japan. They had the pathogen in the soil and in the rootstock, and it was able to spread outside the nursery. And that's continued to be the spread of that particular organism. So being able to target both where the likelihood of intentional introductions are, but also to be able to increase the understanding of the risk of hitchhikers and be able to put some prevention practices in place is something that's really helped us better get a handle on species introductions. For example, there is now a web crawler that searches the web for anyone advertising certain species on the prohibitive list for sale. And they get these little messages, comes out of USDA. There's this little message that, did you know that this is on the prohibitive list? You are not supposed to be selling this in the United States. Actually, they said it a little stronger than that, but that's the concept. But that particular web crawler has been a real boon to those who are trying to manage where some of these organisms may be coming from. So it's a very helpful tool to be able to be focusing on prevention. So it's very clear that when we talk about the prevention issue, it is all about pathways. It's identifying where these organisms might be coming from, what the likelihood is of them being moved from point A to point B, on what source. And I think some of the most popular ones, I just mentioned horticulture trade, transportation systems, roads, shipping lanes where you have the movement of particular cargo lines, sometimes passively, sometimes actively carrying things. And it's been one of the ways that gypsy moth have moved around the country. If you actually look at the spread of gypsy moth from the northeastern U.S., it nicely follows I-95, I-40, I-70, major interstates. Same thing with boats carrying particular invasive weeds and from lake to lake. Gets caught on rudders, and on propellers, it's just moved from one place to another. So we know that there are those kinds of spreads. For many of you, in this issue, roads and trails are very clearly a mechanism of movement in natural areas, not only along those trails, but also laterally from those trails. And so one question is, couldn't you have really enhanced prevention by having a more radical approach to the movement of, whether it be on hikers' boots or ATV vehicles, cleaning them so you don't have the introduction of those organisms along those linear features? Because that's an easy thing to control. Once you get into the natural system, it becomes a hard thing to control. And then the seed trade is another area. So by being able to understand these pathways, focus on these pathways, we really have an opportunity to get ahead of the curve. Early detection, rapid response. We know that prevention is not going to be foolproof, and certainly right now we have a lot of opportunities for introduction. So being able to be identifying those new introductions quickly and then eradicating them as fast as you can is really the next. It's sort of the prevention, early detection, rapid response. It's almost a mantra that you put them all together. And the reason you want to do that is, again, going back to that growth curve, when you have an introduction, you know that we have eradication is really simple at this end, where you have few plants or few organisms. They tend to be isolated. They tend to be clustered. They don't have a lot of compelling factors. You really can get ahead of the curve and be able to eradicate something at this stage. So the ability to identify it down here and treat it is really something that is both economically feasible and ecologically the most appropriate thing to do, versus by the time you get this exponential growth, you really get into a much greater problem in getting control and management underway. We have had some successful early detection and rapid response activities in this country. Many of them tend to have been more human health related, not a surprise, but I think those are some real opportunities for us to follow those examples and what did they do that were so successful. And one of the answers is that you had a systematic approach to identifying these organisms, detection, very broad-based detection, nested with the ability to rapidly identify, have taxonomists be able to determine where the point of origin was, go back to the records, and be able to really basically get the information in place and do a very quick assessment of the issue, and then put some treatment on the ground or in the air, whatever the opportunity is, right away. And that has been, I think, where we've seen the success, is not waiting around, but really being able to respond very quickly. And quickly, we're talking about months to within a year, not 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. Control management and restoration, this is probably where in this country we have put most of our energy. In fact, probably globally we have, because this is the easy one in the sense that a population's gotten big enough, it's a problem, there's political will and financial will to do something about it. And unfortunately, it's probably the most expensive, but it is where we have had some of the greatest experience in how do you deal with some of these threats. And the good news is that in local scale, isolated incidents, we have had some successes of eradication over and over again. They tend to be small established populations. This example in Michigan, where there really was a all-out effort to be able to eradicate the buckthorn through a combination of different tools, and it did prove itself worth the success of that particular treatment. Same thing with purple loosestrife. Over and over again, we'll be able to see biocontrol treatments that have been able to eradicate purple loosestrife. I'd like to say we had a lot more examples than that, but we don't. Caulerpa, which is a seaweed that was introduced, we have had, again, some spot examples where this has been successful. Not throughout its range. Unfortunately, there are still some isolated populations, but just through some concerted effort off the California coast, we have been able to control caulerpa spread. The problem is, just like many of these species, you do it, you get to the eradication stage, this looks really good right here, but I can guarantee you that if you waited another year, you'd have a population reestablishing. It takes concerted effort over a much longer period of time, and the ability to maintain the financial will and the political will throughout that period of time starts waning after you've had some small successes. So you can do it, but really the opportunity to sustain that level of effort does go down. Okay, and then moving on to a topic near and dear to my heart now is the research piece. We really have, as I've said already, we do have information, and we have enough information to be able to start taking some action in isolated areas. And we can take some action about particular species. And we're getting better at the risk assessment process. But we don't have, and we're slowly building, but we're not there, the real underlying theories of population biology and invasive biology. And that will be the big next step. This is just a graphic that Dick Mack from Washington State University has put together, and may no longer be in press because this is from last year. But the idea is to really be able to get away from species by site, almost anecdotal information, but really to start putting together what do we know about the processes, what do we know about the linkages, things like what's the linkage between immigration, naturalization, and invasion against these attributes like environmental context, the characteristics of the organism, the certain circumstances when they get established. If we can start filling in this matrix and better understand it, then we're going to have the underlying theory about how invasion takes place and maybe get out ahead of the curve. Until then, we're probably still going to be fighting battles species by species, maybe larger sites, and hopefully we get a few more pathways included. But this is going to be the real big opportunity to start filling in this kind of a matrix and really understand the overall research process. And then the last thing I want to talk about is public education and awareness. Really, the way this is going to be successful in the long run is to not just have managers doing the job after the fact or regulators regulating the process, but really have all of us be part of the solution. Being conscious of the fact that when you go and walk along a trail, what weeds are you taking as you go from the bottomland up to the top of the drainage? As you go from point to point with your boats, or if you actually have been hiking in the Appalachian Trail and go west, or even worse, if you've been hiking the Pacific Crest Trail through sudden oak death, don't wash your boots and take it to the Appalachian Trail. That's my big nightmare, actually, because I think that could happen so easily. Doing those are things that we as individuals can do, but I think more importantly, bringing this invasive species issue to a much broader public and understanding in the education system, like we have with fire. And for those of you who have followed this, and I know a lot of you are in fire country here, 10 years ago, we didn't talk about fire the way we do now. Fire was just an event. But now so many of us understand. I mean, people in Washington, D.C., people in New York City understand fire ecology. They really do understand what happens in these Western ecosystems, because over time we just kept building and building the story. It's been so many different places. People now understand it better. We need to do the same thing with invasive species issues, because until we do that, we're still going to have the scattered approach, and we're really not going to be able to accomplish as much in as many different sectors as I think we can. And one of the real darn things about invasive species and public involvement is, and you may not be able to see this, I realize the color may not be good. Here, this is that graph I've shown you already before, but where we know from surveys is that public awareness of an invasive species issue does not begin until about the midpoint of the exponential growth. So right there you've got a real problem in terms of when people know and when we really should be taking action. So somehow we've got to get this public awareness turned down to here. So even if it's not a spectacular invasion, it's still important to us. And that's part of the message I think we need to convey. So given all, and I did want to just show one example, is where we have had some successes. It is Australia. For a minute I was, where we have had the introduction, this is a phytophthora species that is very invasive in many different ecosystems. There has been an increased awareness where people are now consciously do boot cleaning, where they really are aware that when they move their ATV from one point to another, it's got to be washed in between. And having more things like this really is an opportunity for us to move forward. Okay, so given all that, these are the steps for a comprehensive approach. A lot of people are using it. There's a lot of pieces of legislation that are building from those particular steps. Now the question is, what are our policy options, and how do we go forward to really link science and policy? And these are two cute little dogs in training. These are invasive species sniffers in Australia. It's one of my favorite pictures, so I like to use it. Okay, so how do we take all this information and move it into the policy world? Well, one is, let's look at the dollars. I mean, there's nothing more compelling than the story of money. And it is absolutely irrefutable that the cost of treatment at the prevention level is a lot less, by orders of magnitude, than what you would have to do at large-scale control. And that's both the direct costs and then the ecosystem service costs of lost values and lost opportunities. So given that, we know that if you were really going to be cost-effective and efficient on the problem, it would be prevention, it would be early detection, it would be rapid response and eradication. Boom. You don't let it get big. You don't let it hit that exponential curve. That's the way, that is really the most effective way to work. And combined with that is really integrated vector management. It's the pathways. It's being able to identify where these organisms are being moved, how they're being moved, and to take some more effective action on that. So that's a very simple basis for moving ahead on any kind of a policy. There are several different places where policy can be achieved, and this is not going to be an extensive policy lecture, but just to get everybody thinking the same way, in the non-native and invasive species arena, we're looking at every scale, from global to local. And at the global scale, we have some very important opportunities and things that are in place that take advantage of addressing invasives. The Convention on Biodiversity has a resolution all about limiting the spread of non-native invasive species. The International Plant Protection Convention, which has, it's global in coverage, it really does talk to limiting the movement of plant pests and invasive plants. And then trade regulations. And that's probably the most powerful and the most controversial opportunity, because we have, I mean, this is the backbone of most developed countries, is the ability to trade. It's the backbone of developing countries, because to enter a new market gives them an opportunity to be economically viable. So trade's going up in all different sectors. Developing countries are the ones that are probably at greatest risk of new invasions because they don't have all the regulations in place to stop things coming in. So it is a concern, I think, globally for the movement of organisms. This is the annual tracking of ships in the Pacific. This is Hawaii. No wonder Hawaii gets very concerned about what happens. And so the fact that we have this global movement, and this is just not commercial tankers, these are cruise ships that are unregulated. These are pleasure cruisers of one sort or another that are unregulated. And if you look at that entire spectrum, there are lots of opportunities for movement in the Circum-Pacific alone. Now, the good news is that the World Trade Organization has finally agreed a year ago to start talking about invasive species. Now, we're not at the regulatory side, but anytime they just get something on the table means it's going to take a couple years, but at least it's in front of all of those delegates from all the countries thinking about that issue. The Asia-Pacific Economic Commission has put invasive species on their list of things to be considering. So over and over again, I think people are recognizing this as an issue, and at very high levels globally with regard to trade, we have some opportunities to influence the movement of species. State and nationally, probably the greatest tools we have are agency regulations, which you could barely see, and legislation. Let's get up. So legislative activities, we actually have several things in the works in this country. Most of them are going back to those comprehensive steps for comprehensive strategy that includes the prevention side, eradication, research, public awareness, and those elements are built into these pieces of legislation, which is good news for us. And I think the more that we can encourage, I think actually the weed bill finally got passed, the others are still in the works. But perhaps more lasting, because it takes a long time for legislation to get in place, and you have administration differences, and you have Democrat versus Republican differences, is non-regulatory. If you can have administrative procedural changes, these are things that an agency at a federal or state level says, we can do this within our own particular responsibilities, just moving into place. You actually get things done a lot faster. And there is movement taking place in these areas, which is even the better news. One is this whole idea of having a volunteer cadre for early warning systems. That I remembered hearing about the weed warriors, I think it was in New Mexico and Arizona, for the Forest Service. People who were on the ground, these were not government employees, these were ranchers and local citizens who want to be part of a monitoring for the integrity of the grazing lands. They were beginning to be looking at weeds as part of the job they do. When they're out there riding the range, they're keeping track of the weeds that they see in a tab sheet. Really important and valuable information if put into a system that you can do something with, and we can talk more about that. But it's a good step forward, getting the awareness of what people are doing. The exotic plant management teams of the National Park Service. If you haven't heard of those, it really is a brilliant idea. Establish a dedicated team for collection of parks that are there at your call if you're a manager to ask, what do I have and what do I do about it? And those folks seem to be very effective to the point where they're growing rapidly and funds are being added to expand that particular program. Putting just prevention into federal and state best management practices. You know, these are voluntary, non-regulatory, but carry the force of agreement that, yes, prevention is important, and we're going to do something about that and build it into our system. And then the last one, which I'm really proud of, because the Nature Conservancy was a major force on this, as well as many other partners, is a voluntary code of conduct by the nursery industry, the trade industry, that was established in the Missouri Botanical Garden in St. Louis. That's why it's called the St. Louis Accord. And it was a good step forward for the nursery trade to say, hey, we have responsibility here. We are, as an association, going to do what we can to reduce the importation of invasive species or potentially invasive species. Now, the difficulty with the nursery associations is there's a big one, but then there's many small nurseries, and so getting the word out is the next challenge. But that message does seem to be getting out, and many states have picked on that. So that's another real opportunity for us, and I think there are a lot of other examples of administrative and policy, non-regulatory fixes. And then the last one I just wanted to mention, because just looking outside here in the hills above Missoula, taking local action through the establishment of weed management areas where you have a collection of landowners, public, private, coming together saying we're going to manage within this area to have the shared responsibility for treat for weeds. The idea of being able to work collectively like that to really take some action in a positive way and to really control the spread and prevent if possible. And the whole idea of these cooperative weed management areas has been really successful in many places around the country, and may be a way we can take that authority and use it for other species. And then the whole idea of just getting local people together to do on-the-spot management is getting a lot of traction, and a lot of people are supportive of it. So I think those are, there really is a host of policy opportunities out there. All of these have been built on the science that I talked about before. And I think that's something really important to recognize is even though we know we have some big gaps in science, we're able to start taking action based on what we know and continuously improving the next steps and being able to improve the where we go with our next opportunities. Now, one thing I did want to just leave with, and not totally end on we've been really successful. This is not without challenges. Aside from the fact this is incredibly complex, it's not just about weeds. In fact, I wish it was more about weeds because, in fact, we know more about plants than anything else in this arena. But it is about insects and pathogens. It's about terrestrial systems, aquatic systems, about marine systems. All of those issues, there's a compilation of critters that are out there that we're struggling with. So how do you get your hands around it? Well, it is going back to that risk, and being able to assess risk is perhaps one of the first steps. But we also know that there are some other challenges that we need to work towards. Adaptive management is the first. Continuously improving what we know, doing the research, and then changing our management to respond to that. It's not only about non-native invasive species, it's really about any management we do. But this issue, I think, really lends itself to a good, robust adaptive management approach. For one thing, there's a lot more people who want to get on dealing with non-native invasive species than some other management issues. So it's a big consensus builder. But it is one that I think we really need to be able to move ahead on. The second one, and we could have a whole long conversation about this, is reconciling societal values. Wilderness is a great example. What is that wilderness for? Is it to provide a pristine environment, safe for everything else, any human introductions, or is it a place for solitude? And then how would you overlay invasive species on top of that particular issue, and how you would go forward with it? And so that idea of trade versus protection. We know we have to have trade. We also should be encouraging developing countries to have more aggressive trade practices so that they can develop. On the other hand, we also don't want uncontrolled trade moving organisms all around the globe and perhaps threatening the very societal values we want. The food versus biodiversity issue, that is always on the table. We know that conservation of biodiversity is incredibly important for sustaining the planet. But we also have people who are starving to such extent that do you make some compromises to provide new sources of food, and what is that? So there are some really huge questions associated with this that we have to resolve as we go forward in trying to address the invasive species issue at a global scale. And then the last one, and the one that is perhaps most of concern to the government agencies, is if we know that we have to rapidly respond to a new organism, how do you get the money and the people to the place as quickly as you possibly can, given all the other constraints we have? And we certainly don't have an endless supply of dollars to work from. And so thinking about through those challenges, it sort of creates a process forward. If you build off the science, if you know you have this comprehensive approach, you know what the steps are that you have to do, then how do we just build some of these processes into addressing those steps? And I think there are some real opportunities out there to do that. So I'm going to close with my favorite invasive species. This is the Asian longhorn beetle, for those of you who don't see it, or have not seen it before. I think we do have a really strong basis for taking action, and increasingly I'm seeing some real positive move forward, not only globally, as I've mentioned, but in this country, the will to make progress, to really put prevention on the table. I think the biggest opportunity for us as a country would be to do what has happened in Australia and New Zealand, and that's to take the guilty until proven innocent approach to importations. That alone would make a big step forward for prevention. Right now, anything can come into this country unless we've already proven it to be a problem. Sort of the inverse. It takes a lot to get things banned from and quarantined in this country. So just making that one little shift would really make a big difference for us. And we think we have enough science now to be able to make a compelling case if you can start lining up all the different constituencies, all the different sectors that really have a concern about it. So there's some good news out there. There's a lot yet to be learned, but I think we have enough success stories that we can build upon to really move this issue forward. And with that, I'm going to thank you for my remarks, and we're going to move on to the Q&A side of it. But thank you. Am I facilitating this myself? I can do it. Okay. Yes.
I have a question about if there's any research or even any current policy on how should I put this? I was working in the restoration business for a couple of years, and our nursery, when we would grow trees, we would go to these places and collect the seeds and then grow the trees, but we would inoculate them, like mycorrhizing from like Montana. And there's always a big question on the effects of non-native mycorrhizing in the places we were restoring. Has there been any research done on that, or have you seen any big negative effects, or maybe like the same use of
Do you all hear the question? About has there been any research that's been done? I'm going to shorten your question. Yeah. Any research that's been done on non-native mycorrhizal and the movement of inoculated materials with mycorrhizae from one place to another? And I'm going to have to say I'm sure there has been, because I think I don't study the literature that much in that level of detail, and it seems like I have seen some, especially where we've been doing outplantings from nurseries from one place to another. There have been some small studies about that. In terms of a comprehensive assessment, I'm not aware of that, but I know we have some specialists here who may. Jim, Peter, okay. Anybody know the answer to that better than I do? Okay. But it is, no, that's a good question, because that's the kind of thing is we take those, we do a lot of that kind of thing as we're developing new strains, as we're trying to get success from one plant from one place to another. And are there some unintended consequences of that? It's a good area for research. Hey, you need a project, right? Yes?
What's the Forest Service's stance on invasive species in wilderness areas? Protected designated wilderness areas in terms of controlling them?
You know, I'm not sure. I know we have an invasive species strategy that's laid out a lot of different approaches from active management to research. And I'm not sure if we have an established policy about what kinds of treatment we would have for invasive species. I'm going to ask Jim, do we have an established policy, Mr. Oliveira?
I think our position has been more to recognize, that type of land as some of the strongholds to keep clean and take action to preserve as some of our priorities. As far as the treatment goes, it's been varied. There has been some, but it varies by what the situations are. I don't know from a policy standpoint, from an action and decision standpoint, to say like the anti-conflict Hitler on this west side, we've taken some initial control actions from pulling some small infestations, and when it got beyond us, we went through the public process and took some minor actions with small action with some herbicides. But that was like the second order of business. So that's a policy of keep it clean where we can. Now in the Salway Bitterroot, we have a whole different situation relative to being already inundated by some natural, but then you're talking about some other species encroachment. So it's on a case-by-case basis. I think as an agency, it's the acknowledgement that those are usually clean areas and a protection prevention standpoint.
I think the overall subject, not the policy side, but just the whole issue of how do we manage wilderness, and how do you interpret or use or or treat the different perturbations that are coming from outside wilderness areas and what they might be doing in the long run. We have Class A watershed or Class A airsheds where we're concerned about air pollution, and we've made a very deliberate decision on that one. But there are some of these other perturbations that, do you allow them to get well established, or you do actually treat them at a very large scale? I think there's some real critical needs to answer that from a broader perspective, and certainly not just the Forest Service. I think this is the community-wide is how we might be addressing that. Yes, sir.
Other than money, what's stopping the Forest Service from getting the individual forests and regions to focus more on prevention and controlling weeds? There's a lot of weed plans being written, and there's not a lot of money going into preventing the vectors of weed seed dispersal.
Well,
What can scientists
sorry, what was the last part?
and what can scientists do to get forests?
The question is, what's the Forest Service doing about building prevention into the management plans of the national forests, and then what research might be doing? That's sort of the shorthand version of that. Well, the first step, and this has been not only, again, Forest Service, but I think all the land management agencies, to just recognize that it's not just about control and management, but it's also prevention, early detection, rapid response, is fairly recent. And that's one reason why we have the National Invasive Species Council, getting all the agencies to work together. The Forest Service has an invasive species strategy that's laying out all those different pieces. So, if, very bureaucratic sense, you got to build from a national platform. You get the tools out there, and then you start moving that out to the field for implementation. I think that's where we are right now. I don't think we have gotten much beyond. The strategy just came out last year and has laid out some of those pieces. Now you take it into the actual planning stage, and then how would you get each individual forest to be able to begin adopting that approach? I think that's where we would be working with the specialists in each region to better define what those parameters might be, what the standards and guides would be. Now, what research can do is better describe some of those pathways, better do some of the analysis that would be needed to say that these particular organisms have greater likelihood of occurrence. Perhaps more importantly, get the tools in place so that people can do the treatment faster, be able to respond as quickly as they can. But frankly, the prevention picture it's almost not at the national forest. In fact, I know it's not at the national forest level. The big prevention question is even allowing it into the United States or into a large region. Once you start talking at a local land unit basis, then you're almost losing the battle. You really have to push it back further beyond any individual land management unit. And I believe that's the main success. Yes?
Is there any formal mechanism to deal with native species that become invasive due to capture?
Oh, good question. Is there any formal process to address native species that become invasive because of changing condition? And I think formal process in the sense of an overall strategy to deal with that, I'd say probably at a national level, no, I'd say there isn't one. I think my feeling is that you would probably be treating a plant or a species, mostly a plant, that would become invasive like that as you would any kind of disturbance that might be occurring, that might be changing your management plan or changing your goal. It certainly is true that we're trying to promote native species as an alternative to non-natives because we feel like they probably have greater resiliency to site factors, well established, have more contribution to local biodiversity. But it's almost, you'd have to, like many of these other species issues, you take it species by species rather than sort of a comprehensive approach, because I think we're still missing some of that knowledge.
It seems like we have in the past, both states and different agencies have taken some action against some natives that you might call out of balance, whether it's some forest insects or some native grasshoppers or some other types of species. But I don't know that they got legally designation other than for that particular area. Actions have been taken and associated local authorities to do that, but not calling them noxious weeds or something.
Actually, grasshoppers is a good example because when grasshopper populations get so large that they become a nuisance or a threat actually to some other sustainability factor, then people start taking action in terms of trying to control those those species. That kind of an epidemic, natural epidemic, if it affects some societal value, then it seems like we do take action. Yes?
Yeah, from a prevention standpoint, are there any policies for evaluating biologically engineered organisms before they're released into uncontrolled systems?
Okay, the question, I missed one important word. Question again, please?
Yeah. Is there any, from a prevention standpoint, any policy for evaluating biologically engineered organisms before they're released into uncontrolled systems?
There is actually, the question is, from a prevention standpoint, are there any policies associated with genetically engineered, genetically modified biocontrol agents? And yes, there is a national policy that USDA is a major participant of and actually oversees with EPA on the whole testing of and release of biocontrol agents in general. And it's a very elaborate process. And then GMOs as a subset of that. And right now, I don't think you have anyone go in that direction, except maybe in some very specific agricultural crops, because the nature of going through the whole process for biocontrol agents at all is very long and involved, and appropriately long and involved.
At what point do you step back and wash your hands of a species? When spotted knapweed's rampant. What point does the agency or does society as a whole wash their hands from that and just accept it as the new?
Something that's established and naturalized. There's some great questions here. That's one that we always have a struggle with, because it's clear that at some point the diminishing returns suggest that I can't manage anything. You're just throwing money down a rat hole, and what's the point? I don't think there is any one established policy. I think every individual species and condition requires its own analysis. And the example I'm going to give you is gypsy moth, which has probably been in this country and the most well-established and most well-studied of any non-native invasive, except for maybe chestnut blight. But the concern with gypsy moth is the host type is still here. It's only covered 25% of its original host type. We'd been spending, 20 years worth, $20 million a year, I guess, of gypsy moth control, when we finally said, I think it was about 6 years ago, all right, let's take a step back. Did the analysis, what is the rate of spread, where's the risk, what's the likelihood of us doing anything in the generally infested area, and we walked away from the generally infested area. We put those resources and said, in fact, we could get more return on our investment by slow the spread. We created a band around the outer reach of the infestation where it was spreading, so it was going west, it was going south, a combination of rapid response eradication, intensive monitoring, and some backstopping with the generally infested area on high-value sites was the change in the strategy that was used. And the difference, though, is that there are still some locations, as an example, Great Falls National Park right outside of Washington, D.C., no one wants to see gypsy moth in that site. There's high visitor days. It's a beautiful site, lots of lush vegetation, and it's outside the nation's capital, and there's too many visitors. And so we're spending lots of money every year to control gypsy moth in that designated area because it has a lot of social value, no ecological value from the standpoint of sustaining any larger ecosystem. So I think those are the trade-offs you have to make. Spotted knapweed in the area, that's another one you have to think about, is what values will you lose if is the population so large that you can't do anything more with it, and what values will you lose if you don't continue to take some action. My guess is you will end up in a similar place where there will be some areas requiring intensive management over a longer period of time because of other values associated with that, and in other places you may just need to walk away.
So what happened in those areas where you walked away? Like, was it extremely destructive? Was there...
In the gypsy moth case?
Yeah.
They were there's a self-sustaining population, which is one of the definitions for becoming naturalized. And there was just enough of the host type left that they could sustain themselves in that particular area. And what would happen is every few years there'd be a gypsy moth outbreak. From societal perspective, you're going to end up with lots of caterpillars all over, squishy things, dropping frass on all the campgrounds. It's a very ugly experience if you've been through the height of one of their infestations. And then they'll go away. And they have these cycles of 4 to 5 years. You lose oak, you'll lose some of the primary host trees, and you have a new forest that comes in behind it that is lesser in terms of the understory vegetation now becoming the overstory. And it just sort of sustains itself. It has not totally collapsed. It has slowed. Now, there was actually another fungus that came in, unknown from where it came from, that was a natural enemy that has sustained and pushed back that population of gypsy moth. But there's not concerted effort in that the big 25% of the U.S. where it was initially established.
Is that fungus native or not?
It was a non-native and associated with gypsy moth in China. And no one's quite figured out how it got introduced to this country. Somebody says an enterprising pathologist brought it in. But it's not an invasive. It doesn't, in the sense that its Entomophica mimaiga is the pathogen. It doesn't exhibit invasive characteristics. It doesn't have all those things that I mentioned, traits in terms of wide niches, but it's very targeted on gypsy moth, highly focused, has no other host type. So in some ways it's an associated pathogen that is not a bad one to have, but it is not native to the U.S. originally.
So then it is possible that if we decide to not wage war on these species, that things will balance themselves out.
They would, yes, they would certainly balance themselves out in terms of certain species mixes, but what do you lose in the meantime? And I think that's the fundamental question of this whole issue of non-native invasive species and why we're concerned. I mean, I would not suggest, for example, chase everything that's introduced to a new environment. The magnitude of the effect, the rapidity of the effect, the ecosystem altering nature of it, to me that's where you make the priorities. Sudden oak death. Sudden oak death will kill a tree in less than a year. It moves so fast. If it was introduced into the oak forest of the eastern U.S., which has already lost the elm, the chestnut blight, or the chestnut rather, it's lost dogwood, it's now lost hemlock. How much more can this system take without it being a really different radical ecosystem? And then you have other factors. So but that's a societal call. But the species, yes, they will mix and intermix, but it's what you lose in the meantime. And to me, that's one of the big questions about how we go forward with the different strategies on invasives. And all the way in the back.
I just got a question about the $186 billion figure you have, the $1.4 trillion figure you have. Where does that come from? I just can't see spotted napkins as costing that much. Unless you're coming in the cost to society to eradicate it. In which case, I would think we should be looking for cheaper ways to eradicate it rather than trying to eradicate it.
Well, it's $137 billion for the U.S. That includes the cost of management, eradication, control, whatever, of all of the different invasives that have been identified in the United States. This is actually a Pimental et al. 2000, or I think it's 2000. I have the reference over here. So it is in the literature. But it includes all of that, plus all of the values lost because of those species. So, for example, gypsy moth, you've got the cost of the treatment of the gypsy moth, you have the cost of the education programs, you have the lost revenues. I've been in these campgrounds with frass raining down all night, and you can't walk outside without slipping on caterpillars. Those campgrounds get shut down. People don't want to visit to those areas. The loss of the vegetation associated with that, so you have market impacts. All of that gets rolled into the $137 billion. And a lot of it has to do with the extrapolation of those costs on industries or on other kinds of economic sectors, business sectors. And then the 1.4 trillion globally is really a coarse figure, but it's sort of the wrapping up all of those things that I just talked about, but at a global scale. And probably a real underestimate from that standpoint. Yes?
I have a question about private land. There are some private landowners and ranchers who have an economic incentive to manage invasives here in the West. But then there are other landowners who purchase property at a recreational value or scenic value who might not be interested in managing invasives or might not know about
The question is when you have a mixed ownership on private lands, and I throw in public lands there too, because there's mixed ownership for that too, where you have some of the private landowners managing for an outcome where managing with the invasives, to eradicate the invasives makes sense, and other landowners, they don't care, is not a concern, and there's not really an issue with it, and how do you resolve those differences? And you know, the answer to that would help, for all land management issues would be a big solution, but I think there are some models on the table for invasives that are particularly compelling. And the cooperative weed management area concept is, to me, a great example where I've seen it working, where it really is the basis. It usually requires some charismatic or some just passionate person within that area to make it happen. But the idea of being able to bring different land entities, patient explanation about what the problem is, why it's a problem in this land and not this land, but really bringing the community together and then using the cooperative weed management area concept as a way to treat. But it is, I mean, it has to be about getting people to the table, talking neighbor to neighbor, and explaining why, even though it may not be a problem to you, it is a problem to me. But more importantly, it's not a problem to you now, but it will be, and if you understand how these different processes work or why it's important. So like so many of these things, it's personalizing it, it's making it as a neighbor-to-neighbor thing, it's not really a government. I mean, I guess that's what I really believe, that in many of these issues, it's not the government taking action so much as getting the community together to really help solve those problems. But it's interesting to me, of all the different environmental issues I've had to deal with over my career, the invasives one has been the greatest consensus builder, and I've been around the table with people who on timber are way other extremes, but around invasive species are willing to come together and talk about common solutions, because it is such a huge problem for all the different factors. And so maybe if you get common ground that way, then you can put other issues on the table and help work towards some kind of resolution on it. Okay, now he's had two already, so I'll take yours first, and then, well.
Have you found that certain types of ecosystems or certain types of disturbances are more susceptible to invasive species taking over?
Well, certainly for plants, I think we know that any ground disturbing activity does tend to open up sites for new invasions. So that is, and so post-fire, for example, that's one of the big concerns. After a fire, you have all that disturbed land, and invasive weeds are very prominent to come in after that. There's no one ecosystem. I guess the way to answer this is that in similar ecosystems, so a species from another country of one ecosystem is more likely to invade the similar ecosystem in the other country. And so if you know, one of the things that Dick Mack talks about, as well as many of the other invasive species biologists, is if you have better understanding of the point of origin of a particular species, what ecosystem they're in, then you can determine the risk of that other ecosystem. I think that's the only generality one can really make. Unless anybody had a different opinion? So does that help answer your question? Yeah.
Can mammals be considered invasive species? And if so, has anybody ever considered Homo sapiens invasive?
There are some philosophical conversations that have gone on about the humans being invasive. You can take that. Mammals, there are some mammals that are considered non-native invasive in the sense that I've been describing them, where they really cause some major harm. It's an interesting question. You know, it's the same issue of the young woman down here raised, is at some point, do you just let everything mix and come to a new equilibrium, new steady state, new dynamic? And I think it's just, what are you going to risk along the way? I don't have an answer for that one, very. Okay, here and then back there.
Are there any models that you know of where they're considering like a native plant or native species easement or certification, where you could offset some of the cost in like a tax break for landowners to manage for native species?
The question is there any discussion going on about providing easement opportunities or some trading, land trading to promote the use of native species in one area to offset where they may not be used in another area, like carbon trading or wetlands mitigation banking. No, not in that sense. Now, there is some discussion going on right now about could we bring ecosystem services to a marketplace? And things like water, biodiversity, native species could be part of that marketplace, but in a very general sense. I don't think it's gotten to the point of truly what it would look like. How would you do that kind of trading? But there is definitely an interest in this community about providing ways for people to stay on the land, to keep forests and forests, to keep open land and open space. And so you've got to give people another option, an economic base around that, and paying for ecosystem services may be that way, valuing them enough that somebody who provides the headwaters of a major stream actually gets some dollar return on that. And so natives would fit that pretty well. I can't. The only other, actually there may be one place, like red-cockaded woodpecker in the southeast. They've used areas where a landowner is actually managing for preservation of RCW habitat. They're getting a break on being able to more actively and aggressively manage other lands that they own, mostly timberland. So that would be sort of, I think, what you're talking about. Back there?
Yeah, huge numbers of organisms hit our shores every year. Quite a few of them are found in our native systems. They spread to native systems. Only a few of those become strongly invasive species. What are your feelings or your thoughts about screening these organisms to determine what would be mechanisms to screen them to determine those few that are going to become strong invaders from the plethora which are just going to be more like sit there?
Well, my feeling is that, yes, we should be doing that. I mean, that would be, to me, one of the most effective things that we could do as a country is to better take what information we have now. Now, it's not perfect, so it's going to have to be continually improved. But we know certain things about if a species like this Asian longhorn beetle, this beetle is invasive in its own native China. Now, it's a native, but it's still invasive. It is devastating on the native poplars. So if you know that if it goes to an analogous ecosystem, it's going to be invasive. You would keep it off the list. It would not be allowed to come in to be imported into a country and to be looking for it. You can start racking up those species. You can be doing those kinds of assessments. And they have done that in New Zealand. That's part of their whitelist strategy. And it has not brought, one of the arguments is it would bring horticulture to its knees. And in fact, it has not. There was a period of about a year and a half while all the species were being screened that things slowed down, but things have picked back up, and there is a continued importation of new species into New Zealand, but they're doing it in a very risk management style and process. So I think that is such a logical way to go. And what's interesting is some states are starting to go in that direction in the U.S. And what we've noticed about the invasive species issue is once you have a lot of local jurisdictions starting to take action, then the industry gets so panicked and concerned about having these too many different standards to manage that they look for a national standard. And I think I would not be surprised if you see that kind of movement at least in certain sectors. Yes, was there? Okay, sorry.
I know the Nature Conservancy has been talking to Peter about killing wild hogs. I was kind of wondering how that panned out.
The question is that the Nature Conservancy had some interaction with PETA over killing wild hogs and what happened with that. And I think you're referring to the situation in Hawaii. And as far as I know, that there has been a continued movement to the wild hog elimination in certain areas of land and moving them over to some of the native Hawaiian homeland lands where hog hunting or wild pig hunting is a popular part of their culture. But as far as I remember, that they moved ahead with eliminating hogs in certain chunks of preserve. Is that the same for what? For the continental United States? I cannot answer that. I don't know. I'm not aware enough of where they've done those kinds of activities. I guess Santa Cruz Island, there was some, I don't know if that's in Texas. Okay, I'm sorry. Anything else? Okay. Whoa. I'm going to start here, then there, then there. Okay. Wait. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Regarding biodiversity, I was wondering,
how you felt societal values and/or public policy may have changed between now and when you first started your career?
Oh, interesting question. How is biodiversity, public policy on biodiversity, and public opinion too, changed since I started my career? Well, certainly the one thing is that, well, I started my career was in 1982. So we're talking about it a lot more. And the fact that there was no Convention of Biodiversity, I don't think then. There's certainly been a lot more recognition of the issue in the general mainstream press and in the general public than I think there had been at that point. And certainly in ecology, I think we've gotten, we're really broadening the scope of where ecologists go in both applied sciences and basic sciences. So that definitely has been a change. I think the other thing that is now, it's gotten past, it seems like it's gotten past people taking sides to how do we work together to achieve some of these common goals. And you're seeing that increasingly in certain areas. Of course, rose-colored glasses are possible here too, but that's my belief. Up here?
What's the one success you're most proud of?
Oh my gosh. It has nothing to do with invasive species, but when, where was it, early 90s, I co-led the U.S. delegation to Montreal to establish the Montreal process for sustainability and set up the criteria and indicators for sustainability, forest sustainability globally. And to see that go from what was an agreement by a bunch of technical people going to that meeting to actually have been adopted and now being part of the reporting process for sustainability for U.S. in a real sense by government is an incredible change, I think. So, yeah, I do look at that. Oh. Nice to be reminded of that, actually. Okay, gentlemen. Wait.
How do you feel about invasive species when they attack other invasive species? Is it supported, or do you just try to take both around your
Boy, that's sort of, I guess, the management of the risk associated with it. If you do have the example of the Entomophaga maimaga, the fungus on gypsy moth, more power to the fungus. It's killing the gypsy moth. The gypsy moth is ecosystem changing, the fungus is not, and therefore, ecosystem altering rather, and therefore let the fungus stay. But if you have a combination of both really severe ecosystem altering organisms, then the question is, if you can you take them both on at the same time and really be more aggressive? But I'll go back. You keep throwing money away when you keep trying to control something that's really gone so expansive versus prevention. And I think being able to better assess where is the best investment to be made and looking at those trade-offs. Maybe that's the first thing I would do is before I made too much action. A more interesting question is, what do you do when you have an endangered species killing another endangered species? That's happening too. So it's always an interesting question. One more question, I guess right here.
How do you differentiate what's invasive and what's just natural ecological succession progression?
The way I would interpret it, there's probably a real scientifically defined process for this. It's the speed and the magnitude and the timing. I think that's the real difference. And you just have this such rapid response of these populations, eliminating everything in its face. I think that really does shift it over. And again, I'm trying to make it clear that non-native invasives is really what I've been talking about. And I think that's where you really have some opportunity to take action. If you just have a native that's become invasive for other characteristics, then that's a social choice and management choice. What do you do with that? Is that it?
Yeah, let's thank you.
Thank you all. Appreciate the questions.